After abandoning his pregnant mistress, a millionaire thought he'd escaped responsibility. 5 years later, she returned as his new boss, having secretly built her own empire while raising their child. Now she controlled not just his career but also his company's future. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The penthouse apartment, a monument to Julian Thorne's success, felt colder than ever. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the storm raging inside him. 5 years. 5 years since he'd walked away, leaving Isabella pregnant and heartbroken. 5 years of self-deception, buried beneath a mountain of wealth and fleeting pleasures. Now the mountain was crumbling. The knock on the door was sharp, decisive. He knew who it was, even before the crisp, professional voice announced, "Mr. Thorne? Isabella Rossi." His breath hitched. Isabella. He hadn't seen her since that night, the memory a searing brand on his soul. She stood in his doorway, a vision of controlled power in a tailored pantsuit. Gone was the vibrant, carefree Isabella of their passionate past, replaced by a woman sculpted by hardship and ambition. Her eyes, once sparkling with adoration, now held a chilling composure, a glacial calm that spoke volumes. "Julian," she said, her voice smooth as polished granite. "It's been a long time." "Isabella." He couldn't find the words, his throat thick with a cocktail of shame and disbelief. "I'm here to discuss your future with Thorne Industries," she stated, stepping into his opulent apartment, her presence filling the space with an undeniable authority. The faint scent of expensive perfume, something sharp and clean, contrasted sharply with the stale aroma of expensive whiskey and regret that clung to his surroundings. He watched, mesmerized, as she surveyed his meticulously curated life, the abstract art, the priceless sculptures, the view that stretched across the glittering city. A bitter laugh escaped him. It was all so hollow, so meaningless now that she was here. "I've accepted the position of CEO," she announced, the words hanging in the air like a death knell. The casual way she said it, as if merely stating the time of day, was the most devastating blow. His carefully constructed world began to tilt on its axis. His attempts at casual dismissal, the nonchalant "good for you," died on his lips, strangled by the sheer weight of his past actions. This wasn't a casual business meeting. This was a reckoning. Isabella's gaze swept across his penthouse, lingering on the untouched scotch, the expensive artwork, the breathtaking view, all the trappings of a life he'd built on the ashes of his past. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations, the only sound the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Julian felt a tremor of fear, a cold dread that chilled him to the bone. This wasn't just a business takeover. It was a personal invasion. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some feeble justification, some pathetic attempt at control, but no words came. Isabella's expression remained impassive, yet he saw a flicker of something else, pain, perhaps? Or was it simply the cold calculation of a woman who had meticulously planned this moment for 5 long years? "Thorne Industries," she finally said, her voice low and measured, "needs restructuring, significant restructuring." She moved deeper into the apartment, her movements deliberate, graceful, each step a subtle assertion of dominance. The scent of her perfume, sharp and clean like mountain air, clashed sharply with the stale aroma of regret that clung to him. I understand," Julian stammered, the words feeling clumsy, inadequate. He wanted to deny, to deflect, but the truth was a lead weight in his stomach. He had built an empire, but it was crumbling before the woman he'd wronged. Isabella paused, her eyes meeting his. He saw a trace of sadness there, a ghost of the woman he had loved, a woman now forever altered by his betrayal. "Your involvement will be minimal," she continued, her voice devoid of emotion. Yet her words carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken resentments. "For the good of the company, of course." A bitter laugh escaped Julian. Minimal involvement? He'd built this company from the ground up. This was his life, his legacy, and now it was slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. He looked at the rain-streaked windows, at the city lights twinkling below, and a wave of profound loneliness washed over him. He had lost everything: the woman he loved, the child he'd never known, and now even his empire. The storm raging outside mirrored the tempest within him, a maelstrom of shame and regret. The reckoning had begun. The mahogany boardroom felt colder than usual, the polished surface reflecting Julian's ashen face. Isabella, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, sat at the head of the long table, a stark contrast to the opulent chaos of his penthouse. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the scent of expensive leather and impending doom thick in the air. "The Q3 projections are disappointing," Isabella stated, her voice calm but firm, each syllable precise. Her eyes, the same captivating shade of hazel he remembered, held no trace of the warmth he once knew. Only ice. Julian swallowed, his throat dry. He'd spent the last few days desperately trying to spin the numbers, to conceal the disastrous consequences of his reckless decisions. Now, facing her, his carefully constructed facade threatened to crumble. "There were unforeseen circumstances," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. A faint smile played at the corner of Isabella's lips. Unforeseen? Or perhaps predictable? The slight tilt of her head, a subtle shift in her posture, was a silent declaration of her superiority. She'd anticipated his every move, his every desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the polished wood digging into his spine. The weight of his actions, the years of self-deception, pressed down on him, suffocating him. He glanced at the clock, each ticking second a hammer blow to his already shattered ego. Isabella leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Julian," she said, her voice dropping to a near murmur. "5 years ago, you chose convenience over responsibility. You abandoned me, and you abandoned our son." The last words hung in the air, heavy with unshed tears. A stark accusation laid bare. The pain in her eyes, the raw, unadulterated hurt, was more devastating than any public humiliation. He saw it now, clear as day, the depth of her pain mirroring the depth of his own regret. This wasn't a battle for control. It was a battle for his soul. The reckoning was far from over, and the price of his abandonment was far steeper than he could have ever imagined. The boardroom's chill seeped into Julian's bones, a stark contrast to the opulent warmth of his penthouse. Isabella's gaze, a glacial hazel, held him captive. He flinched under the weight of her unspoken accusations, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, each second a hammer blow to his pride. "Convenience?" she repeated, her voice low, laced with a quiet fury that was far more potent than a scream. "You chose convenience over a life." The words hung in the air, thick with unshed tears, a dam about to burst. He opened his mouth to protest, to offer a flimsy excuse, but no sound emerged. The opulent mahogany, the meticulously arranged flowers, even the expensive scent of the air freshener, all felt mockingly out of place, a grotesque parody of the success he so desperately clung to. Isabella rose, her gray suit falling in sharp, elegant lines. The movement was a silent declaration of her power, her complete control over the situation, over him. She walked towards the expansive window, the city sprawling beneath, a glittering expanse of indifference. "Leo," she murmured, her voice barely audible, the single word shattering the remaining vestiges of his composure. The image of his son, a bright, curious boy, flashed in his mind, a constant, painful reminder of his betrayal. He saw the boy's questioning eyes, the tentative smile that sometimes faltered, a subtle reflection of the insecurity he himself had caused. Turning, she faced him again, her expression unreadable. "He asks about you," she said, her voice still quiet, but with an undercurrent of steel. "He wants to know why you're not there." The simple statement was a devastating blow, far more potent than any financial blow he could have imagined. He saw the years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the quiet strength reflected in her eyes. The ice was melting, revealing a profound well of hurt. Julian finally found his voice, a choked whisper. I didn't know." It was a pathetic excuse, and he knew it. He saw the skepticism in her eyes, the hurt too deep for words. "You chose not to know," Isabella corrected, her voice firm but not unkind. There was a flicker of something else in her eyes, a hint of something he couldn't quite name. Sadness? Longing? The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had lost more than a company. He'd lost his family, his chance at redemption. The reckoning had begun, and the price was far steeper than he'd ever imagined. The mahogany boardroom felt like a mausoleum. The scent of expensive leather and polished wood was suffocating, a stark contrast to the crisp, clean air of Isabella's office, a space that reflected her power, not his outdated opulence. He watched her, silhouetted against the panoramic city view, her shoulders rigid with barely contained fury. The silence stretched, heavy and pregnant with unspoken accusations. "Leo," she finally said, the single word a fragile bridge across the chasm of their broken past. The name hung in the air, a tiny, vulnerable thing amidst the grandeur of the corporate empire she'd built. Julian winced. The image of his son, a boy with his eyes and Isabella's determined chin, filled his mind. He saw the child's hesitant smile, a fragile flower threatened by the cold winds of neglect. Guilt, sharp and bitter, clawed at him. "He asks about you," Isabella continued, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of 5 years of unanswered questions, 5 years of silent longing. "He wants to know why you're not there." The question echoed the emptiness in Julian's own life, a void he tried to fill with fleeting pleasures and superficial success. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some feeble explanation, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the rising tide of his own shame. He saw the subtle tremor in her hands, a fleeting vulnerability that belied her composure. He saw the years etched into her face, the lines of worry and strength, a testament to her resilience. He saw the strength in her gaze, a steely determination that had carried her through hardship, a strength he had never truly appreciated. I didn't know," he finally managed, his voice a pathetic rasp. The words felt hollow, inadequate, a feeble attempt to shield himself from the brutal truth of his abandonment. Isabella turned, her gaze piercing, yet softened by an unspoken sorrow. "You chose not to know," she corrected, her voice firm, but with a hint of weariness that touched him unexpectedly. "You chose convenience over a life." The words hung in the air, a dam finally breaking, releasing a torrent of pent-up emotion. Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill over. He saw a flicker of pain, of hurt, but also something else, a faint glimmer of hope, a fragile possibility of forgiveness. The reckoning had begun, and the price, he now understood, was his very soul. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, crushing him beneath the immense burden of his past. He had lost more than just his company. He'd lost his family, his chance at redemption. And now, facing the woman who built an empire while raising his son alone, he was left with nothing but the crushing weight of his regret and a desperate hope for a second chance. The air hung heavy with unspoken words, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Isabella's office, a minimalist sanctuary of steel and glass, felt a world away from Julian's mahogany-walled prison. He watched her, the city lights painting streaks of gold across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her jaw, the weariness etched around her eyes. He saw the ghost of the girl he'd known, buried beneath layers of strength and controlled fury. "Leo, he's bright," Julian finally stammered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The confession felt pathetically inadequate. Isabella turned, her gaze unwavering. "He's resilient," she corrected, her voice low, a controlled tremor betraying her composure. "He learned that from me, from watching me build a life for us, a life you walked away from." The words were not an accusation, but a statement of fact. each syllable laden with the weight of 5 years of sacrifice. He saw a single tear trace a path down her cheek, catching the light before disappearing into the shadows of her perfectly sculpted cheekbone. It was a stark contrast to the icy control she projected, a crack in the carefully constructed facade she presented to the world. I understand," he began, but the words felt hollow, empty vessels incapable of carrying the weight of his remorse. She let out a short, almost imperceptible breath. "Understanding isn't enough, Julian." The quiet intensity of her voice cut through the silence, a sharp blade piercing his carefully constructed defenses. "Regret doesn't change what happened." He shifted uncomfortably in the plush chair, the leather cold against his skin, a physical manifestation of the chill that had settled in his soul. The scent of expensive coffee couldn't mask the metallic tang of fear that coated his tongue. I want a chance to show you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. To show him, the mention of Leo triggered a fresh wave of guilt, a suffocating tide threatening to drown him. Isabella met his gaze, her eyes deep pools of sorrow and quiet strength. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence humming with unspoken emotions, regret, hurt, a fragile spark of hope. The city lights shimmered outside, a silent witness to the beginning of their reckoning. The future, uncertain and daunting, stretched before them, a landscape etched with both pain and the faintest promise of redemption. The next morning, Julian found himself staring at his reflection, a stranger gazing back. The expensive suit, usually a source of confidence, felt like a costume, ill-fitting and suffocating. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing the tremor in his hands. The city below, a panorama of glittering towers, seemed to mock his predicament. He was a prisoner in his own gilded cage, his success hollow and meaningless. A knock on the door broke through his self-absorbed contemplation. It was Leo, their son, all of 5 years old, eyes mirroring Isabella's intensity, but with a child's innocent curiosity. He clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted and one button eye dangling precariously. "Daddy?" Leo asked, his voice hesitant, yet tinged with a surprising confidence. Julian's heart lurched. He hadn't seen his son in 5 years, hadn't deserved to see him. The image of the boy, his face small and fragile in his mother's arms, 5 years ago in the airport, was an incessant reminder of his failure. The guilt, a constant companion, clawed at him. He knelt, forcing a smile, a mask he felt utterly incapable of wearing. "Hey, Leo," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The boy extended the teddy bear, a silent offering. Julian took it, the worn fabric unexpectedly soft against his skin. "Mommy says you're coming to dinner," Leo announced, his tone matter-of-fact, devoid of the resentment Julian had anticipated. There was a startling honesty in his gaze, a directness that stripped away Julian's defenses. The dinner was a stark contrast to Julian's opulent lifestyle. Isabella's apartment was modest yet warm, filled with the scent of home-cooked food and the soft glow of lamplight. The silence at the table was palpable, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and Leo's occasional excited chatter about school. Julian watched Isabella, her grace a stark contrast to the steely composure she maintained at the office. Her eyes, however, held a depth of sadness that mirrored his own. Later, as Leo was tucked into bed, Isabella spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "He asked about you often," she said, her words carefully chosen, each syllable carrying the weight of unspoken emotions. "I told him the truth, that you made a mistake, but that you're trying to be a better man." Julian looked at her, his gaze searching for any hint of forgiveness, a glimmer of hope amidst the wreckage of his past. The city lights shimmered outside, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, mirroring the uncertainty of their future. The air thrummed with unspoken words, a silent conversation that hinted at a complex path ahead, a road paved with regret, forgiveness, and the fragile hope of redemption. The aroma of roasted lamb filled Isabella's modest apartment, a stark contrast to Julian's usual Michelin-starred dinners. "Leo," perched on a booster seat, recounted his day with an infectious enthusiasm, his small hands gesturing wildly. Julian watched, mesmerized. The boy's resemblance to him was undeniable, a poignant reminder of the life he'd forfeited. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and unexpected, a familiar ache that settled deep in his chest. Isabella's gaze, though calm, held a veiled intensity. She refilled Leo's water glass, her movements precise, economical. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken accusations and fragile hopes. The clinking of cutlery seemed amplified in the quiet. "He's remarkable," Julian finally said, his voice a low rumble. He meant Leo, but the words could have applied to Isabella as well. Her quiet strength, her resilience in the face of his betrayal, had built an empire, and a life that Julian could only dream of. Isabella met his gaze, her eyes a deep, fathomless well. "He is," she replied, her voice soft, almost a whisper, "and he deserves a father." The words hung in the air, a challenge, an invitation. The unspoken question resonated. Could Julian rise to the occasion? Could he earn the right to be a part of this life, this family he'd abandoned? The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a suffocating burden. Yet, amidst the guilt, a fragile spark of hope flickered. The lamb, tender and succulent, tasted surprisingly good, a small, unexpected pleasure in this unexpected family meal. He was still far from redemption, but for the first time in 5 years, the path forward, however arduous, no longer felt entirely impossible. The following morning, Isabella's office felt colder than usual. Julian, summoned for a routine meeting, found himself acutely aware of the sterile, modern decor, a stark contrast to the opulent chaos of his own penthouse. He sat stiffly, the polished mahogany of the desk a cold reflection of his own apprehension. Isabella entered, her tailored suit impeccably sharp, her demeanor as cool as the morning air. The scent of her perfume, a subtle blend of jasmine and sandalwood, was the only warmth in the room. "The Peterson account," she began, her voice devoid of emotion, "requires immediate attention. Your expertise is necessary." The emphasis on necessary was a thinly veiled barb, a reminder of his diminished status. Julian bristled. "I'm still capable, Isabella." His voice, though firm, lacked its usual confidence. The weight of her words, of his past actions, pressed heavily on him. Isabella leaned back, her expression unreadable. "Competence isn't enough, Julian. Loyalty is." Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, met his. He felt a familiar tremor of fear, but beneath it, a burgeoning sense of shame. He had lost more than his mistress. He'd lost respect, trust, and, perhaps most significantly, himself. The meeting continued, a tense dance of power and resentment. Yet, beneath the veneer of professional formality, a subtle shift occurred. Isabella's instructions, though demanding, were precise, revealing a strategic mind he'd never fully appreciated. He found himself unexpectedly engaged, his analytical skills sharpening, his old drive rekindling. He offered suggestions, his ideas meeting with her approval, a quiet acknowledgement of his worth that resonated deeply. Leaving her office, Julian paused. The city skyline stretched before him, a panorama of glass and steel mirroring the intricate complexities of his life. He felt a familiar ache in his chest, but this time it wasn't solely regret. It was a mixture of regret and something else, a glimmer of hope, a fragile sense of purpose. Perhaps, he thought, redemption wasn't impossible. Perhaps he could earn back what he'd lost. The journey would be long and arduous, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to begin. The mahogany boardroom felt oppressive, the scent of polished wood and expensive leather clinging to the air like a suffocating perfume. Julian sat across from Isabella, the chasm between them wider than the expanse of the city visible through the panoramic windows. Sunlight glinted off her diamond earrings, a stark contrast to the shadows gathering in the corners of his eyes. "The marketing campaign," Isabella said, her voice a low, controlled hum, "needs a complete overhaul. Your input, Julian, is requested." The word requested hung heavy with unspoken implications. He saw the ghost of a smile play on her lips, a fleeting expression that spoke volumes of her simmering power. Julian cleared his throat, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the room. "I've already," he began, then stopped. His carefully constructed arguments crumbled in the face of her unwavering gaze. He felt the weight of 5 years of neglect, of missed opportunities, pressing down on him. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The leather felt cold against his skin, mirroring the icy detachment in Isabella's eyes. He knew he was walking a tightrope. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and he risked losing everything. The fear was palpable, a cold knot in his stomach. "Your previous efforts," Isabella continued, her voice still calm, "lacked a vision. This campaign needs to reflect a bold new direction, one that resonates with our target demographic." Her words were carefully chosen, each syllable a subtle jab at his past failures. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words died in his throat. He saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a fleeting glimpse of the passionate woman he'd once known, buried beneath layers of resentment and controlled fury. "He's been asking more about you," she began, her voice low. About what you do, who you are." She paused, her gaze searching his. "He deserves to know his father." Julian felt a lump form in his throat. He could only manage a barely audible, "I know. I haven't stopped him from asking," Isabella continued, "because I believe it's important for him to have a relationship with you, a healthy one. But it has to be genuine, Julian. Not out of obligation, but out of love." He looked at Leo, his sleeping son, a miniature version of himself, and felt a pang of regret so profound it stole his breath. The years of neglect, the self-imposed exile, all seemed to crush him. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse. I want to be a father to him." The words, uttered with trembling sincerity, hung in the quiet room, a fragile bridge across a chasm of pain and regret. The following week was a blur of board meetings and tense negotiations. Julian, usually the picture of effortless charm, found himself flustered, his carefully crafted composure cracking under Isabella's unwavering gaze. The air in the boardroom crackled with unspoken accusations, the scent of expensive coffee unable to mask the underlying tension. He tried subtle maneuvers, attempting to subtly discredit her decisions, but Isabella anticipated each move, her counter-strategies precise and devastatingly effective. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Julian found himself in Leo's small, meticulously organized bedroom. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. Leo, curled up amidst plush toys, stirred in his sleep. Julian knelt beside the bed, his hand hovering over his son's soft hair. The child mumbled something unintelligible, a tiny hand reaching out in his sleep. A wave of profound emotion washed over Julian, a mixture of guilt, remorse, and a desperate yearning for connection. He gently tucked the blanket around Leo, the soft fabric a stark contrast to the harshness of his own life. He felt a tear trace a path down his cheek, the salty sting a stark reminder of his past mistakes. He felt something shift within him, a crack in the hardened shell he'd built around his heart. Leaving the room, he walked towards the balcony, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. The cool night air was a welcome respite from the suffocating weight of his emotions. He pulled out his phone, the screen illuminating his face. He typed a message to Isabella, a simple, "I want to talk." He found her in her office, the stark minimalism a reflection of her controlled nature. She looked up, her eyes mirroring the weariness he felt, yet holding a flicker of something akin to hope. "I saw Leo," he began, his voice rough. "He's remarkable." Isabella's lips curved into a faint smile. "He is," she replied, her voice soft, a stark contrast to the icy demeanor she displayed in the boardroom. "He's strong, just like his mother." A hint of bitterness laced her words, but it was quickly replaced by a quiet resignation. "And he's beginning to ask more questions about you." Julian nodded, the silence heavy with unspoken words. The weight of his actions pressed down on him. This wasn't a business negotiation. It was a plea for forgiveness, a desperate attempt to reconcile with the woman he had wronged and the son he had abandoned. He knew the road ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile spark igniting in the darkness. The boardroom felt colder than usual that morning. Julian, perched on the edge of his mahogany chair, felt the chill seep into his bones, a mirroring of the icy dread tightening his chest. Isabella, impeccably dressed in a tailored pantsuit, addressed the board with her usual calm authority, but Julian noticed a tremor in her hand as she gestured towards the projected quarterly reports, a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. He shifted uncomfortably, the expensive fabric of his suit doing little to soothe his frayed nerves. Later, in his opulent office, the scent of old leather and expensive cigars did nothing to mask the growing anxiety. He stared out at the sprawling city, a million twinkling lights mocking his loneliness. His phone buzzed. It was Leo's teacher. A pang of guilt, sharp and familiar, pierced him. He hadn't seen his son in weeks, too consumed by his desperate attempts to regain control. He picked up the phone, his voice a strained whisper as he spoke to the teacher about Leo's progress. The teacher's warm tone, her praise of Leo's kindness and intelligence, were a stark contrast to the bitter taste of his own inadequacy. That evening, Julian found himself drawn to Leo's room again. The nightlight cast a soft amber glow, illuminating Leo's peaceful face. He sat beside the bed, watching his son breathe, the rise and fall of his chest a quiet rhythm against the backdrop of his own turbulent heart. He reached out, hesitantly touching Leo's forehead, a feather-light touch that sent a wave of unexpected tenderness through him. He whispered a quiet apology into the air, a confession to the silent witness of his son's innocence. The silence in the room was deafening, heavy with years of regret and the unspoken promise of a future he desperately hoped to mend. He knew he couldn't buy his way back into Leo's life or Isabella's heart. He had to earn it, and as he sat there, the city lights a silent backdrop to his internal struggle, he finally understood the enormity of the task ahead. He felt a flicker of hope, fragile but persistent, rising amidst the ruins of his past. The next morning, Isabella's cool gaze met Julian's across the mahogany boardroom table. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. He flinched under the weight of her scrutiny, the scent of her expensive perfume, a sharp, unfamiliar blend of bergamot and sandalwood, a stark reminder of their fractured past. "The Peterson account," she stated, her voice a low, controlled hum, "requires immediate attention. Julian, I need your expertise." His ego, usually inflated to bursting, deflated slightly. He'd hoped to derail her, to use his experience to subtly undermine her authority. But her directness disarmed him. He cleared his throat. "Of course, Isabella. I've already reviewed the projections." He avoided her eyes, the lie catching in his throat like bitter ash. Later, in his office, the city a shimmering tapestry below, he wrestled with the reports. The Peterson account was a tangled mess, his previous negligence evident in the chaotic spreadsheets. He felt a familiar wave of shame, this time tinged with a different emotion, fear. Fear of failure, yes, but also a deeper fear of losing Leo. He found himself unexpectedly drawn to the family photograph on his desk. A candid shot of Leo, a cherubic 5-year-old, laughing as Isabella held him close. The warmth of the image, a stark contrast to the icy chill of his office, was almost painful. He picked up the phone, his fingers trembling slightly. He needed to see Leo. The call was brief, clipped, even hostile. Isabella's voice, though devoid of any warmth, held a hint of resignation. "He's at school," she said, "and you have a meeting in half an hour." The click of the phone was the sound of a door closing, a wall reinforcing itself between them. Yet, that evening, a small gesture shattered the brittle wall. He found a half-eaten cookie, still warm on Leo's nightstand, a chocolate chip cookie, the kind he knew Leo loved. A small, simple act, yet it spoke volumes. Isabella wasn't wholly unforgiving. A flicker of hope, delicate, hesitant, ignited within him. He knew the road to redemption was long, but for the first time, he saw a glimmer of possibility at its end. The boardroom felt colder than usual, the polished mahogany reflecting the icy tension between Julian and Isabella. The scent of expensive leather and stale coffee hung heavy in the air, a bitter aroma mirroring the taste in Julian's mouth. Isabella, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, addressed the board with a quiet authority that left no room for dissent. Her gaze, however, occasionally flickered towards Julian, a silent challenge in its depths. "The Peterson account," she repeated, her voice calm but firm, "remains critical. Julian, your input is required." The emphasis on required stung, a subtle reminder of his diminished power. He swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his anxiety. He'd spent the past week subtly undermining her strategies, planting seeds of doubt amongst the board members. His efforts had failed, a humiliating defeat amplified by the quiet confidence radiating from Isabella. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. The words he'd rehearsed felt hollow, inadequate. Later, alone in his opulent office, the panoramic city view offered no solace. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, the glittering cityscape a mocking reminder of his superficial success. He picked up a photograph, a faded image of Leo as a toddler, his face smeared with chocolate. A wave of regret washed over him, sharp and painful. He'd missed so much, so many precious moments. That evening, he found himself at Leo's school, waiting nervously. The playground buzzed with the sounds of children at play, their laughter a jarring contrast to the turmoil in his heart. When Leo finally appeared, his eyes wide with surprise, Julian's carefully constructed defenses crumbled. "Dad?" Leo's hesitant question hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Julian knelt, his heart aching. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched Leo's cheek. The small boy didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. It was a silent acknowledgement, a tentative bridge across the chasm of years. "Hey, son," Julian whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "How was school?" The simple question felt monumental, a step towards the unknown future. The silence that followed was filled with unspoken emotions, regret, hope, the fragile beginnings of reconciliation. The air crackled with a new kind of energy, not one of animosity, but one thick with potential. The city lights outside, reflected in Leo's wide, innocent eyes, seemed to shine a little brighter that evening. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian's office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He sat hunched over his desk, the weight of the previous evening's encounter settling heavily on his shoulders. The city's vibrant pulse felt distant, muted by the turmoil within. He reread Isabella's email, a concise summary of the Peterson account's challenges, a stark contrast to the emotional torrent he'd experienced with Leo. He picked up a framed photo of Leo, now a thoughtful-looking 10-year-old. The boy's resemblance to Isabella was striking, yet there was a hint of Julian's own stubborn jawline. A pang of regret, sharp and sudden, pierced his chest. He hadn't just abandoned Isabella. He'd abandoned a part of himself. The afternoon brought an unexpected meeting with Isabella. She entered his office, the scent of her perfume, a subtle blend of jasmine and sandalwood, a familiar yet foreign comfort. She didn't sit, her posture radiating controlled power. "The Peterson account," she said, her voice devoid of the usual icy edge, "requires a collaborative effort. I need your expertise." Julian felt a tremor of hope, a fragile bud pushing through the hardened soil of his guilt. He cleared his throat, his voice unexpectedly steady. I understand. I've been reviewing the data. I have some ideas." He found himself outlining his proposals with surprising clarity, years of ingrained business acumen surfacing despite his emotional turmoil. The subsequent discussions were devoid of their usual animosity. There was still an undercurrent of tension, but it was laced with a new element, a shared acknowledgement of the monumental task at hand. They dissected the Peterson account with focused intensity, their voices blending in a surprising harmony. Isabella, for the first time, offered him a genuine smile, a brief flash of warmth that shattered the icy facade she had so carefully constructed. In that fleeting moment, he saw not his former mistress, nor his intimidating boss, but a woman carrying the weight of years of hardship, a woman who had found strength in adversity. As they worked late into the night, the city lights outside transformed into a breathtaking panorama of hope, a silent witness to a tentative beginning. The next morning, a hesitant knock echoed through Julian's opulent, yet strangely empty, apartment. He opened the door to find Leo, clutching a worn baseball glove. Sunlight glinted off the boy's dark hair, mirroring the glint of unshed tears in his eyes. "Hi, Dad," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible. The formality, the unfamiliar title, punched Julian in the gut. The scent of freshly baked bread filled the air as Leo settled onto a plush armchair, his small form swallowed by the oversized cushions. Julian, unsure of how to bridge the chasm between them, offered a stiff smile. "So, baseball, huh?" Leo nodded, fiddling with the glove. "Mom says you used to play." His gaze drifted towards a framed photo of a younger Julian, a cocky grin plastered on his face, holding a baseball bat. A pang of guilt, sharp and raw, tore through Julian. He hadn't just abandoned Isabella, he'd abandoned a piece of himself. He'd abandoned his potential to be a father. "Yes," Julian admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I did." A silence stretched, heavy and pregnant with unspoken words. Julian watched Leo's focused gaze and knew this wasn't about baseball. It was about connection, about a father he desperately craved. He cleared his throat, finding his voice with surprising ease. "Tell me about your game," he offered gently, reaching out to gently adjust Leo's glove. The boy's hand trembled slightly, but he remained firm. It was a small yet potent gesture of trust. Julian felt a surge of hope, fragile but persistent, as if a tiny flower was pushing its way through the frozen ground of his past. The afternoon sun, streaming through the window, cast a warm glow on the two of them, illuminating the possibility of a future he'd almost completely destroyed. The conversation flowed, tentatively at first, then more freely as Leo's stories of games and triumphs filled the room. For Julian, it wasn't just about baseball, but about reclaiming a relationship he had carelessly thrown away. It was a small step, but a significant one on a long, arduous journey toward redemption. The boardroom, usually a stage for Julian's confident pronouncements, felt suffocating. Isabella's presence, radiating quiet power from behind the mahogany desk, was a constant reminder of his failure. The scent of expensive leather and polished wood couldn't mask the underlying tension. He nervously adjusted his cufflinks, the cold metal a stark contrast to the burning shame he felt. "The Peterson account," Isabella said, her voice calm but firm, "requires immediate attention. Julian, I need your expertise on this." He flinched. Her expertise was a carefully veiled insult, a reminder of his past arrogance. He'd scoffed at her ambitions back then, dismissing her as a dreamer. Now, his expertise was a grudging necessity to save her company, his company. "Of course," he managed, his voice a low murmur. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He felt the weight of his past mistakes, heavy as the silence that followed. Later, in his secluded office, the city lights a blurry canvas outside the window. Julian stared at Leo's drawing, a stick-figure family inexplicably happy. He picked up a pen, a familiar weight in his hand. The smooth motion of writing felt oddly soothing, an escape from the turmoil within. He began to sketch, focusing on the lines, on the form, not the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He wasn't drawing a perfect family. He was drawing hope. That evening, a knock on his door. It was Leo, clutching a worn teddy bear, its fur matted and one button eye missing. The boy's eyes, mirroring his mother's strength, held a hesitant question. Can I sleep here tonight?" Leo whispered, his voice barely audible above the city hum. Julian felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent years building walls, and now a small boy, his son, was chipping away at them, one hesitant question at a time. He cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Of course, son." Leo's small hand found his, surprising Julian with its warmth and strength. As Leo fell asleep on the plush sofa, Julian watched him. A mixture of love, regret, and a fragile hope blooming in his heart. The opulent apartment suddenly felt less empty, less like a gilded cage. Felt like home. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian's office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He found himself staring at Leo's drawing again, the stick-figure family a stark contrast to the coldness of his surroundings. The boy's innocent depiction of happiness felt like a reproach. A wave of guilt washed over him, stronger than the expensive coffee he'd just consumed. He picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over Isabella's number. Hesitation warred with a desperate need to connect, to apologize, to perhaps explain. He finally pressed the call button, the ringing a relentless pulse in the quiet room. "Julian." Isabella's voice was cool, professional, yet a hint of weariness laced her tone. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Isabella," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "About last night, Leo." "He's fine," she interrupted, her voice sharper now. "He enjoyed spending time with you." A pause, filled with unspoken emotions. "But this isn't a solution, Julian. This isn't a reconciliation." He flinched. Her words were a cold splash of reality. He'd hoped for something more, a softer response, a crack in her carefully constructed composure. "I know," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I understand, but I want to be a part of his life, a real part." Another pause. He could almost hear her taking a deep breath, the silence heavy with years of hurt and resentment. "It'll take more than a night, Julian," she finally said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "It will take consistent effort, genuine remorse, and a significant change in your attitude." The words hung in the air between them, a silent challenge. He knew she was right. He'd failed her and he'd failed Leo. He wasn't sure if he deserved forgiveness, but the thought of earning it, of rebuilding a relationship with his son, filled him with a strange mixture of hope and trepidation. The sun seemed brighter now, the dust motes less threatening. The long road to redemption had begun. The mahogany boardroom felt colder than usual. Julian sat, the leather of his chair unforgiving against his tense back. He watched Isabella, her silhouette sharp against the panoramic city view, addressing the board with an effortless grace that both intimidated and strangely captivated him. He'd expected anger, a lingering resentment in her eyes, but instead, he saw a focused intensity, a steely determination that resonated with quiet power. The scent of expensive coffee hung heavy in the air, a bitter reminder of his own inadequacy. Later, in his sparsely decorated office, a stark contrast to the opulence of his former life, he found Leo's drawing again, tucked into a file. The child's rendering of their family, a wobbly stick figure Julian, a taller one representing Isabella, and a small one, Leo, nestled between them, tugged fiercely at his heart. He traced the lines with a trembling finger, the cheap paper surprisingly soft beneath his touch. A wave of nausea rolled over him, a physical manifestation of his guilt. He picked up his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the warmth he felt radiating from the drawing. He dialed Isabella's number, the dial tone a relentless metronome counting down the seconds to a potential confrontation. He'd rehearsed 100 apologies, yet none seemed adequate. "Julian." Her voice was surprisingly calm when she answered, a controlled flatness that hid a torrent of emotions he knew lay beneath the surface. "What is it?" "Isabella, I wanted to apologize again, for everything." His voice cracked, the words spilling out in a rush. The weight of 5 years of silence, of missed opportunities, pressed down on him. A long pause. The silence was thick, heavy with the unspoken accusations and the lingering pain. He could almost feel the chasm between them, a vast emptiness carved by his own actions. Then, her voice, barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of her experiences. Your apologies, Julian, are meaningless unless accompanied by actions that demonstrate genuine remorse. The words were a cold reality check, but within them, he detected a sliver of hope, a glimmer of possibility. The battle for her forgiveness, he realized, had only just begun. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung in the air of Leo's hospital room. Sunlight, filtered through the gauzy curtains, cast long shadows across the floor. Leo, pale but otherwise unharmed after a minor bicycle accident, slept soundly, a small plaster cast encasing his scraped knee. Julian sat beside the bed, a worn leather-bound book lying forgotten in his lap. He watched Leo, his chest constricting with a mixture of relief and something akin to love he hadn't known he possessed. Isabella entered, the crisp lines of her tailored suit a stark contrast to the soft, muted tones of the room. She carried a steaming mug, the aroma of chamomile tea a gentle counterpoint to the antiseptic smell. She didn't speak immediately, simply placing the mug on the bedside table and sitting beside Julian, her presence radiating a quiet strength. The silence stretched, filled only with the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and Leo's soft breathing. Then, Julian spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He's strong, he said, his gaze fixed on his son. Isabella nodded, her eyes softening. He's resilient, just like his mother, she replied, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. It was a small smile, but it held a world of unspoken emotion, a testament to her strength, her unwavering spirit, her forgiveness. Julian shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. He cleared his throat. I wanted to apologize again, for everything. He felt the familiar sting of tears pricking at his eyes, but held them back. Isabella reached out, her hand gently covering his. Her touch was surprisingly warm, comforting. It's not about apologies anymore, Julian. It's about actions. Her voice was soft yet firm. He squeezed her hand, his gaze shifting back to Leo's sleeping form. The small, fragile figure stirred slightly, his brow furrowed in his sleep. Julian felt a surge of protectiveness he'd never experienced before, a profound love that transcended guilt and fear. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a path toward redemption paved with his renewed dedication to his son and the woman who had unknowingly given him a second chance. The silence between them was no longer heavy with accusations, but filled with the unspoken promise of a future he desperately wanted to share. The boardroom, usually a stage for Julian's power plays, felt different now. The mahogany table gleamed under the soft light, reflecting the strained faces around it. Isabella, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, addressed the board, her voice calm yet commanding. The air thrummed with unspoken tension. The scent of expensive coffee couldn't mask the underlying anxiety. Julian, relegated to a spectator's role, watched, a knot tightening in his stomach. He'd expected resentment, perhaps even open hostility. Instead, he saw grudging respect, a quiet acknowledgement of Isabella's leadership. He saw it in Mr. Henderson's subtle nod, in Ms. Davies's attentive posture, even in the usually antagonistic Mr. Chen's quiet observation. Isabella was proving herself, not just as a competent CEO, but as a force to be reckoned with. This wasn't the fragile woman he'd abandoned. This was a woman forged in the fires of adversity, stronger, sharper, more powerful than he'd ever imagined. A wave of guilt washed over him, stronger than the expensive brandy he'd consumed earlier. He'd underestimated her then, underestimated her now. His attempts to undermine her had backfired, highlighting her competence instead. He saw now the subtle ways she'd manipulated his sabotage to her advantage. A quiet chess match he'd lost before it even began. Later, alone in his opulent apartment, the city lights twinkling mockingly outside his window, he poured himself another drink. The crystal glass felt cold against his fingers, a stark contrast to the burning shame in his chest. He picked up a framed photo of Leo, a candid shot from the hospital, a small, reassuring smile playing on Leo's lips. He traced Leo's face with his finger, the image blurring through unshed tears. A soft knock echoed, followed by Isabella entering the room. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the city lights behind her. She wasn't accusing, wasn't angry. Her face was etched with a weariness that mirrored his own, a shared exhaustion born of years of struggle and regret. I need to talk," he began, his voice a low rumble. Isabella closed the distance, her presence filling the vast room with a quiet power. She didn't speak immediately, only meeting his gaze with an intensity that cut through his defenses. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words, laden with the weight of their shared history, their shared son. "Talk," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. The city lights flickered outside, casting dancing shadows on her face, highlighting the subtle softening around her eyes. It was a small shift, a crack in the formidable wall she'd built around her heart, a fragile hint of vulnerability. And in that vulnerability, Julian saw a glimmer of hope. The path to redemption, it seemed, was long and arduous, yet, for the first time in years, he felt he wasn't alone. The scent of brewing coffee, sharp and bitter, hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sweetness of the pastries Leo devoured. Julian watched them, father and son, separated by an invisible chasm. Leo, all bright-eyed energy, chattered about school, his words tumbling over each other in a rush of youthful enthusiasm. Isabella, her gaze soft as she listened, occasionally interjected with a gentle question, her voice a calming balm against the chaos. The sun streamed through the large windows of their penthouse apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light. Julian felt a pang of something akin to longing. This was a family he'd almost destroyed, a life he'd forfeited. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the comfortable silence. He's a good boy, Leo," he offered, his voice rough. Isabella met his gaze, her expression unreadable. The lines around her eyes, etched by years of hardship, softened slightly. "He is," she agreed, her tone measured. "He's a lot like you, you know?" The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Like him, a successful, driven man, capable of both great love and devastating betrayal? Or something else entirely? Something deeper, more poignant? A hesitant smile played on Isabella's lips. "He has your eyes?" she added, softer this time, a flicker of something akin to forgiveness in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there, a glimmer of hope in the cold, hard reality of his past actions. Julian reached out, a clumsy gesture, towards Leo's hand. The boy looked up, his eyes mirroring the warmth of the morning sun. Hesitantly, Leo placed his small hand in his father's, a silent acceptance that made Julian's heart ache with a mixture of joy and guilt. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a heavy cloak he couldn't quite shed. Yet the warmth of Leo's hand, the quiet acknowledgement from Isabella, these were cracks of light piercing through the darkness. The path to redemption was still long and winding. Yet, in this shared moment, in the gentle sunlight and the quiet hum of the city below, he felt a fragile sense of peace begin to bloom. It was a tentative peace, built on shared moments, small gestures, a mutual love for their son. But it was a beginning, and that, he realized, was everything. The boardroom, usually a stage for Julian's confident pronouncements, felt different now. The mahogany table, once a symbol of his power, seemed to press down on him, heavy with the weight of his past mistakes. Isabella, seated at the head, radiated an authority that wasn't merely professional. It was the quiet strength of someone who had clawed her way to the top, bearing the burden of his abandonment. The air hummed with unspoken tension. "The Peterson account," Isabella began, her voice calm yet firm, "is crucial. We need a strategy that minimizes risk and maximizes impact." Julian, despite his initial discomfort, found himself focusing. He'd spent years avoiding such challenges, but a flicker of his old drive ignited. He felt a strange mixture of apprehension and exhilaration. "I have a proposal," he offered, his voice surprisingly steady. He detailed his plan, the words flowing smoothly, laced with insights gleaned from years of experience he'd almost squandered. Isabella listened intently, her expression unreadable, yet her occasional nods suggested approval. Later, in a quieter corner of the office, they discussed the details further. The scent of old leather and polished wood filled the air. Isabella's gaze was thoughtful, not accusatory. "It's good, Julian," she admitted, a hint of warmth coloring her voice. I want to help," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper, the words a fragile bridge across the chasm of years. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a grudging acceptance of his belated efforts. "The company isn't the only thing that needs rebuilding," she replied, her voice low, the words hanging in the quiet space between them. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a testament to the years of unspoken pain. It wasn't anger. It was sorrow, a silent acknowledgement of the wounds that still lingered. The weight of his past transgressions pressed upon him anew, but alongside it, a fragile hope began to bloom, nurtured by the faintest glimmer of reconciliation. Day ended, and the rain finally ceased. A sliver of hope pierced through the darkness within him. The city lights outside, once a symbol of his isolation, now seemed to shimmer with a renewed promise. The aroma of strong coffee and Isabella's subtle, citrusy perfume filled the air as Julian nervously waited outside her office. He'd spent the previous night wrestling with the implications of their burgeoning collaboration. The city, viewed from his penthouse, had felt less like a symbol of his isolation and more like a canvas of possibility. He tapped lightly on the mahogany door. "Come in." Isabella's voice was calm, devoid of the usual professional reserve. He entered, finding her seated at her expansive desk, bathed in the warm glow of morning sunlight. She looked softer. The lines around her eyes, etched by hardship, seemed less severe, replaced by a hint of something resembling peace. "I've been reviewing the Peterson proposal," she began, gesturing towards a thick file. Her voice, though still controlled, carried a less guarded tone. "Your input on the marketing strategy was insightful." The word hung in the air, a subtle acknowledgement of his growing contribution. Julian swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Thank you. I want to help make this work, Isabella." The confession felt raw, vulnerable. A quiet smile played on her lips. "I know, Julian, and I appreciate it." She paused, her gaze meeting his. "There's something else. Leo's been asking about you. He wants to spend time with you." The mention of Leo stirred something deep within Julian. He'd seen the boy's quiet longing during their infrequent encounters, a yearning for a father he barely knew. The guilt, a familiar companion, tightened its grip. I would like that very much." Later that afternoon, a sense of shared purpose hummed in the air as they tackled the Peterson proposal. Their collaboration felt less like a battle and more like a dance. Julian's suggestions, once met with skepticism, were now welcomed, discussed, and integrated. The tension had eased, replaced by a surprising synergy. As they worked, a shared laughter broke the silence. A genuine laugh, born not of forced camaraderie, but of shared accomplishment and easing tension, felt like a profound shift. The day ended with a shared cup of coffee, a quiet conversation about Leo's baseball game. It wasn't a romantic declaration, but it was a step, a tentative bridge built across the chasm of their shared past. The city lights outside, no longer symbols of his fractured life, seemed to pulse with a newfound hope. The rain had stopped, and the promise of a new dawn, however uncertain, felt undeniably present. He looked at Isabella and saw not just his former lover and current boss, but a woman who, despite everything, was allowing him a second chance, and that, he realized, was worth more than all the wealth in the world. The boardroom, usually a battlefield, felt strangely calm. Sunlight streamed through the panoramic windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Julian, nervously adjusting his tie, watched Isabella address the assembled executives. Her voice, clear and confident, resonated with a newfound authority that even he had to acknowledge. He'd spent weeks diligently contributing, his initial resentment slowly replaced by a grudging admiration for her strategic brilliance. "The Peterson account is crucial," Isabella stated, her gaze sweeping across the room, "and Julian's insights have been instrumental in shaping our approach." The subtle emphasis on his contribution sent a warmth spreading through Julian's chest. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. Later, over a quiet dinner with Leo, the weight of his past actions pressed down on Julian. Leo, a bright, inquisitive boy, was surprisingly comfortable with him now, sharing stories of his school day with an easy familiarity. Watching his son laugh, a genuine, unburdened laugh, shattered the last vestiges of Julian's self-imposed isolation. The clinking of cutlery, the soft murmur of their conversation, felt like a fragile, precious melody. "Dad," Leo said, his voice low, "Mom says you used to tell her stories about the stars." Julian's heart ached. He'd squandered those precious years, leaving Isabella alone to navigate the complexities of motherhood and entrepreneurship. The following week, a tense meeting with a key investor threatened to derail everything. Isabella, cool under pressure, expertly navigated the investor's concerns, but Julian saw the strain etched on her face. He knew he had to act, not just for the company, but for her, for Leo, and for himself. Stepping forward, Julian, with practiced ease, addressed the investor, articulating a solution that seamlessly integrated Isabella's strategy with his own financial expertise. The investor, impressed by their collaborative effort, withdrew his objections. In that moment, Julian saw a flicker of gratitude in Isabella's eyes, a silent acknowledgement of his redemption. That evening, under the soft glow of a shared candle, a rare moment of intimacy unfolded. No grand declarations, just a quiet conversation about Leo's upcoming soccer game, interspersed with lingering glances and unspoken emotions. The city lights twinkled outside, but for the first time in years, Julian felt truly at home, cradled in the warmth of a love slowly, tentatively rekindled. The scent of jasmine, Isabella's favorite, filled the air, a fragrant promise of a future, imperfectly mended but undeniably hopeful. The crisp autumn air nipped at Julian's cheeks as he walked Leo to school. The scent of damp leaves and wood smoke hung heavy, a stark contrast to the sterile air conditioning of his penthouse. Leo, clutching a brightly colored backpack, chattered excitedly about a science project. Julian listened, truly listened, not just hearing the words but absorbing the joy in his son's voice. It was a small moment, yet it felt monumental. Later, at the office, the tension was palpable. A major deal hung in the balance, one that could solidify Isabella's position or shatter her carefully built empire. Isabella, impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, moved with an almost feline grace, her eyes sharp and assessing. "The presentation needs more impact, Julian," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We need to showcase the synergy between our departments, not just the individual strengths." Julian, no longer the arrogant playboy, felt a familiar prickle of anxiety. But this time, it wasn't fear of failure, but a desire to prove himself, not just to Isabella, but to himself. He spent the next few hours poring over the data, collaborating with Isabella's team. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office as they worked, a silent truce hanging in the air. The quiet hum of computers, the tap-tap-tap of keyboards, formed a counterpoint to the rapid beating of Julian's heart. That evening, they shared a simple dinner pasta with pesto, Leo's favorite. The aroma filled the kitchen, a comforting scent that eased the unspoken tensions. Leo, tired but happy, leaned against Isabella, his small hand resting on her arm. Julian watched them, a bittersweet ache in his chest. "The presentation went well," Isabella said softly, her gaze meeting his. Her eyes, usually guarded, held a flicker of something akin to gratitude. "I wouldn't have managed it without you," Julian admitted, his voice husky. The words, simple as they were, felt like a breakthrough. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. Their touch sparked a silent understanding, a fragile bridge built across years of pain and regret. The clinking of forks against plates, the soft murmur of conversation, created a soundtrack to the slow, tentative rekindling of their love. A love built not on youthful passion but on shared responsibility, mutual respect, and a deep, abiding love for their son. The city lights outside shimmered, reflecting the unspoken hopes in their eyes. The following weeks were a blur of board meetings and late-night brainstorming sessions. Julian, surprisingly, thrived in the collaborative atmosphere. The scent of old books and brewing coffee permeated the air as he worked alongside Isabella's team, his initial arrogance replaced by a focused intensity. He saw the meticulous planning, the unwavering dedication, and the genuine respect her employees held for her. It was a far cry from his previous life of superficiality. One evening, after a particularly grueling day culminating in a successful product launch, Isabella found Julian alone in his office, the city lights painting streaks of gold and amber across his desk. He looked tired, but there was a new, quiet strength in his posture. "You did well tonight, Julian," she said, her voice softer than he remembered. He looked up, surprised by the genuine warmth in her eyes. The faint scent of her perfume, something subtly floral and sophisticated, filled the air. "It wasn't just me," he replied, his voice husky. "Your team, they're incredible." He hesitated, then added, "I never really appreciated how much work it takes to build something like this, from the ground up." Isabella smiled, a small, almost shy smile that reached her eyes. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "But Leo, he was my motivation." She paused, a flicker of pain momentarily clouding her expression. "And building this company, it was a way to reclaim my life, my power." He watched her, seeing a woman he barely recognized, strong, resilient, yet still vulnerable beneath the veneer of power. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the hum of the city and the unspoken emotions hanging in the air. The air crackled with a charged intensity, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm they'd both crossed to reach this point. He moved closer, drawn to her by a force he couldn't deny. He reached out, his hand covering hers. Her skin was soft, cool under his touch. The simple gesture conveyed more than any words could. It was a silent vow, a promise of a future built on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the enduring power of a love tested, yet ultimately stronger than ever before. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the expansive windows of Julian's penthouse, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He woke with a start, the lingering warmth of Isabella's hand still imprinted on his memory. He reached for his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the lingering heat. He scrolled through emails, his mind still replaying their silent vow. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, a heavy cloak of regret. Later, in the boardroom, the air crackled with nervous energy. A major investor was threatening to pull out. Isabella, composed as ever, addressed the room, her voice calm and assured. Julian watched, a silent observer, his earlier anxiety replaced by a strange sense of calm. He saw her strategize, her mind sharp and decisive. He saw the respect she commanded, the trust her team had in her. He was seeing her not as his former mistress, but as a remarkable leader. During a break, Isabella found him at the window, gazing out at the cityscape. "Julian," she said, her voice low, "I need your help." He turned, surprised. "Anything," he replied, the words feeling strange yet sincere. "We need to secure this investor. Your connections, your influence." He nodded, understanding dawning. This wasn't about reclaiming control. It was about securing a future, not just for the company, but for their family. The thought resonated deeply. He felt a surge of determination, a newfound purpose. That evening, he orchestrated a meeting, employing tactics he previously used for self-serving purposes. This time, however, the motivation was different. The weight of his actions hung heavy in the air, but it was balanced by a renewed sense of purpose and responsibility. He used his charm, his wit, his strategic mind to win over the investor. He saw Isabella's relief in the quiet victory, felt the shared satisfaction of a hard-earned success. As they drove home, the city lights a shimmering backdrop to their silence. Julian turned to Isabella. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion, the words long overdue finally escaping. The rain started to fall, and the sound of it felt cleansing, washing away the residue of his past. He reached out, taking her hand, his touch gentle. Isabella didn't pull away. The car was silent, save for the rhythm of the wipers and the steady drumming of the rain against the glass. In the shared silence, a fragile hope blossomed, a tentative promise of a future together, not erased of the past but enriched by the scars and the struggles they had overcome. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, Julian felt a sense of peace, a quiet assurance that, perhaps, redemption was within reach. The following week, Julian found himself attending Leo's school play. The air in the small auditorium hummed with the excited chatter of parents. The scent of popcorn and overheated bodies hung heavy. Leo, dressed as a tiny pirate, stood backstage, his face a mask of nervous anticipation. Julian felt a lump in his throat, a wave of unfamiliar emotion washing over him. He watched Isabella, radiant in her simple dress, her eyes filled with a quiet pride that mirrored his own burgeoning emotion. The curtain rose. Leo, surprisingly confident, delivered his lines with a charming swagger. Julian chuckled, a genuine laugh that surprised even himself. Isabella, seated beside him, smiled, a small, subtle shift in her expression that spoke volumes. After the play, Leo, flushed with excitement, rushed to his mother. Julian watched them, a poignant scene playing out before him, a mother's unwavering love, a son's adoration. He felt a profound sense of loss, a pang of regret so sharp it made him gasp. Later, during a quiet moment backstage, Isabella turned to Julian. "He's good, isn't he?" she asked, her voice soft, laced with a hint of vulnerability. He nodded, unable to speak, the words caught in his throat. I never thought I'd see this," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. I'm proud of him." Isabella looked at him, her gaze searching, intense. "It took you long enough," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of years of unspoken pain. He winced, accepting the truth of her words. The silence that followed was not an awkward one, but one filled with unspoken understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the difficult path they had traveled. The scent of Isabella's perfume, light and floral, filled the small space, and it seemed to carry with it the first hints of a fragile hope, the possibility of something new, something more. He knew the road to redemption was long, but for the first time, he felt he wasn't walking it alone. The following weeks were a blur of board meetings, late-night strategy sessions, and surprisingly collaborative efforts. Julian, initially driven by a desperate need to regain some semblance of control, found himself genuinely contributing. His sharp business acumen, once used to bolster his ego, now served a higher purpose, supporting Isabella's vision. The air in the office, once thick with tension, began to lighten. One evening, after a particularly successful product launch, Isabella found Julian alone in his office, the city lights painting the windows in a soft glow. The scent of old leather and expensive coffee hung in the air. He sat at his desk, staring at a photograph of Leo, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "He's starting to look like you," Isabella said softly, her voice barely a whisper breaking the silence. Julian looked up, surprised. "Really?" "Yes," she replied, a hint of wistfulness in her tone. "His eyes especially, that same stubborn glint." She paused, then added, "He asked about you the other day." A wave of emotion washed over Julian, guilt, longing, and a flicker of hope. "What did he say?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "He said, he wants to learn how to play golf with you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Julian felt a lump forming in his throat. He swallowed, forcing down the tide of remorse threatening to overwhelm him. He reached out, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, taking Isabella's hand. Her skin was soft, warm against his. He held her gaze. I want to, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I want to be a better father. Isabella didn't respond immediately. She simply squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of sadness, understanding, and something akin to forgiveness. The unspoken words hung between them, years of hurt, regret, and the tentative beginnings of healing. The city lights twinkled outside, casting a warm glow on their clasped hands, a silent promise of a brighter future. The silence wasn't awkward, but pregnant with the weight of their shared past and the fragile hope of their shared future. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, they walked it, hand in hand. The family trip to the coast was fraught with unspoken anxieties. The salty air, usually invigorating, felt heavy with the weight of their past. Leo, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, shrieked with delight, building sandcastles the size of small dogs. Julian watched, a lump forming in his throat. The years of absence felt like a chasm between him and his son, a gulf he desperately tried to bridge with clumsy attempts at playful interaction. "Look, Dad, a crab," Leo yelled, holding up a tiny crustacean in his cupped hands. Julian knelt, forcing a smile, examining the creature with a detached fascination. It felt surreal, this moment of shared wonder, this fragile connection he was so desperately trying to build. Later that evening, huddled around a bonfire under a sky bursting with stars, Isabella finally spoke. The flames danced in her eyes, mirroring the internal turmoil he sensed. "It's different," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the crackling wood. "Being here with you both. It's not what I imagined." Julian's heart ached. He knew exactly what she meant. Their carefully constructed present was a fragile edifice built on the rubble of his past mistakes. "I know," he said softly, reaching for her hand. Her skin, still soft, felt warmer than the firelight. "I've been a fool." The words, though simple, held the weight of years of regret. He saw a flicker of something akin to forgiveness in her eyes, but it was overshadowed by a lingering sadness. She squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the long road ahead. The crackling bonfire, the scent of wood smoke and sea salt, formed a backdrop to their unspoken promises, their hesitant steps towards a future where redemption might be possible, where love, despite the scars of the past, could still bloom. The journey was far from over, but under the starlit sky, hand in hand, they felt, for the first time, a sense of cautious hope. The next morning, the coastal air was crisp, carrying the scent of brine and pine. Julian woke before Isabella, the rising sun painting the room in hues of gold and rose. He watched her sleep, the soft rise and fall of her chest a testament to the peace that seemed to have settled over them, a fragile peace he was determined not to shatter. He traced the line of her jaw, the faintest shadow of a smile playing on his lips. The weight of his past actions still pressed down, but the lightness he felt was surprisingly potent. He rose quietly, pulling on his clothes, the soft cotton a stark contrast to the stiff formality of his usual attire. He found Leo already awake, building elaborate sandcastles on the beach, his small hands working with surprising dexterity. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Julian said, kneeling beside his son. Leo looked up, a wide, gap-toothed grin spreading across his face. "Dad, look what I built." Julian spent the next hour completely engrossed in Leo's imaginative world, his initial clumsiness replaced by genuine engagement. He learned about the castle's hidden passages, its moat filled with shark-infested waters, and the brave knight who protected it. The laughter that tumbled from Leo's lips was a balm to Julian's soul, a melody that washed away years of regret. Later, at lunch, a quiet moment settled between Isabella and Julian. The sun dappled through the leaves of a nearby tree, casting a warm glow on the table. "Thank you," Isabella said, her voice low, barely above a whisper. Her gaze met his, unflinching and filled with a complexity that both thrilled and terrified him. "For what?" Julian asked, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. For trying, she replied, a faint smile touching her lips. For truly trying. The unspoken words hung between them, heavy with years of unspoken pain and the tentative promise of a new beginning. The weight of the past remained, but in that shared gaze, in the silent understanding that passed between them, Julian saw a flicker of hope that was brighter, stronger, than anything he had ever dared to imagine. The journey was far from over, but under the warm sunlight, the scent of salt and sea air, they were, hand in hand, walking toward a future they were finally creating together. The celebratory dinner at the company's new headquarters hummed with a controlled energy. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow on polished mahogany tables, the clinking of glasses a counterpoint to the hushed conversations. Isabella, radiant in a silk gown, moved through the room with the effortless grace of a seasoned CEO. Julian, beside her, felt a familiar pang of unease. Yet this time, it wasn't fueled by resentment. He felt pride. A quiet, deep pride in the woman he'd hurt, the woman who'd built an empire from the ashes of his betrayal. Leo, perched on a plush armchair, his eyes wide with fascination, watched the adults mingle. He occasionally glanced at his father, a shy smile playing on his lips. This was a new Julian, one who engaged with his son, not with stiff formality, but with gentle playfulness. Later, on the rooftop terrace, overlooking the glittering cityscape, Isabella turned to Julian. The night air, cool and crisp, carried the faint scent of jasmine. "It's different," she said, her voice soft, a hint of vulnerability in its timbre. "Different how?" Julian asked, his gaze locked on hers. The city lights reflected in her eyes, creating a shimmering mosaic of emotion. "5 years ago, I'd have felt nothing but bitterness," she confessed. "Tonight, there's a strange sense of peace, maybe even gratitude." A silence settled between them, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city. Julian reached for her hand, his touch tentative, yet filled with a newfound tenderness. He felt the warmth of her skin against his, a silent acknowledgement of the long, difficult journey they traversed. "I know I can never undo the past," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. For you. For Leo." Isabella squeezed his hand, a silent affirmation. The city lights seemed to twinkle brighter, mirroring the dawning hope in their hearts. The future was unwritten, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't seem terrifying. It held the promise of something new, something built on forgiveness, love, and the unwavering strength of a family forged in the fires of adversity. The journey had been arduous, but under the vast expanse of the night sky, they stood together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Isabella's penthouse apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Leo, nestled in his mother's arms, stirred, his small hand reaching out to stroke her cheek. The quiet intimacy of the moment was a stark contrast to the previous night's celebratory chaos. Isabella, her eyes soft with a love that transcended the turmoil of the past 5 years, brushed a stray curl from Leo's forehead. "He's getting so big," Julian murmured, entering the room, a steaming mug in his hand. He moved with a hesitant grace, his usual arrogance replaced by a quiet humility. Isabella smiled, a tender curve of her lips. "He's your son, Julian." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. The unspoken acknowledgement of a shared past, a shared future, a shared child. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of Isabella's expensive perfume, a subtle reminder of the life she had painstakingly built. Julian sat beside them on the plush, oversized sofa, the soft fabric a comfort against his skin. He watched Leo, a mixture of awe and regret in his eyes. I never thought I'd see this day," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. The vulnerability in his tone was disarming, laying bare the years of regret that had gnawed at his soul. Isabella met his gaze, her own eyes mirroring a depth of emotion that he had never truly seen before. "Neither did I," she replied softly. "But here we are." She reached for his hand, her touch light but meaningful, a bridge across the chasm that had separated them. This wasn't forgiveness yet, but a fragile truce, a tentative step towards a future they were beginning to imagine together. The cityscape stretched out beyond the window, a silent witness to their evolving story, a story of redemption, of forgiveness, and of a family finally finding its way home. Weeks turned into months. The city thrummed outside Isabella's penthouse, a constant, low hum against the quiet rhythm of their new life. Leo, now a whirlwind of energy, shrieked with laughter as Julian chased him around the expansive living room, the plush carpet muffling their footsteps. The scent of freshly baked bread, Isabella's latest culinary experiment, filled the air, a comforting aroma that spoke of a burgeoning domesticity. One evening, nestled on the sofa, a fire crackling merrily in the hearth, Julian gently brushed a stray lock of hair from Leo's forehead. The boy, nestled against his father, looked up, his eyes mirroring the warmth of the flames. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackle. Julian's heart constricted. He'd never felt this profound a sense of belonging, this deep, abiding love. "Yes, son," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Tell me a story," Leo murmured, already drifting towards sleep. Julian glanced at Isabella, her eyes soft with a love that both comforted and challenged him. He began to tell a story, a simple tale of a brave knight and a courageous princess, weaving into it a subtle message of forgiveness and second chances, of overcoming obstacles through love and perseverance. His voice, initially hesitant, gained strength as he spoke, infused with a newfound confidence. The story ended with a triumphant return, a reconciliation, a sense of peace that mirrored the feelings growing within his own heart. Silence fell, broken only by the crackling fire and Leo's gentle breathing. Isabella reached across the space separating them, her hand resting lightly on Julian's. Her touch was electric, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they'd shared, the sacrifices made, the love that had endured. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent promise woven into the simple gesture. The city lights twinkled outside, mirroring the silent, incandescent hope that bloomed within their hearts, a hope for a future as bright and promising as the stars above. The unspoken words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of shared history and the promise of a future built on love, forgiveness, and the unwavering bond of a family finally whole. The annual company gala shimmered. Crystal chandeliers cast a dazzling light on the polished mahogany tables, reflecting in the champagne flutes held by elegantly dressed executives. Isabella, radiant in a silk gown the color of a summer sunset, moved through the throng, a queen surveying her kingdom. Julian, beside her, felt a familiar pang of unease. This wasn't the life he'd envisioned 5 years ago. He'd been the king then, oblivious to the rising tide of Isabella's strength. "Enjoying yourself?" Isabella asked, her voice a low murmur that cut through the background hum of conversation. Her hand, resting briefly on his arm, sent a jolt through him. He managed to smile. "It's impressive," he admitted, the words catching in his throat. The scale of Isabella's success, built on the very foundation of his past betrayal, was both humbling and terrifying. Later, on the balcony overlooking the city lights, a cool breeze chased away the oppressive formality of the gala. Leo, clutching a half-eaten chocolate truffle, leaned against his father. "Daddy, you look sad," Leo observed, his innocent gaze piercing Julian's carefully constructed facade. Julian knelt, his gaze locking with his son's. "I'm just thinking about how much you've grown, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled Leo close, the boy's small body fitting perfectly against his. The scent of chocolate and Leo's clean hair filled his senses. This simple act of affection, this undeniable bond, felt like a balm on his wounded soul. Isabella joined them, her presence softening the cool night air. She wrapped an arm around Leo, her fingers intertwining with his. The three of them stood there, silhouetted against the city's glittering backdrop. A family unit finally forged in the crucible of pain and forgiveness. The unspoken understanding hung heavy in the air, a testament to their journey, a promise of the future they were building together, brick by painstaking brick. The city lights, a million tiny sparks of hope, mirrored the fragile, yet undeniable, flame of their renewed love. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian's penthouse, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He woke with a start, the gala's opulence a fading echo. Leo's small hand, still warm from the night before, rested on his chest. A wave of guilt washed over him. He hadn't deserved this peace. He watched Isabella, asleep on the sofa, her face serene despite the shadows of the past etched beneath her eyes. The lines spoke of sleepless nights and unwavering strength, a testament to the sacrifices she'd made. He reached out, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. The soft skin felt cool beneath his touch. He pulled back, his hand trembling. Later, at the breakfast table, Leo recounted a silly dream about flying pigs. Isabella smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that warmed Julian's heart. He found himself joining in their laughter, the sound a welcome melody replacing the usual silence of his opulent loneliness. "Daddy," Leo piped up, "can we go to the park today?" Isabella looked at Julian, a question hanging in the air. He nodded, a warmth spreading through him. "Of course, son. We'll go to the park." The park was a vibrant tapestry of sights and sounds. Children's laughter echoed through the trees. The scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. Julian watched Isabella, her eyes sparkling as she pushed Leo on the swing. He saw not just the powerful CEO, but the loving mother he'd almost lost. He found himself pushing Leo on the swings, the repetitive motion a soothing balm to his restless spirit. A simple act, yet imbued with a profound sense of connection and reconciliation. As they walked home, hand in hand, a comfortable silence settled between Julian and Isabella. The unspoken words hung heavy with the weight of their shared past and the fragile hope of their future. He squeezed her hand, a silent apology, a promise of better days to come. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful backdrop to a life he was finally learning to embrace. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in years, Julian felt a flicker of hope, a genuine, heartwarming hope. Weeks bled into months. The initial awkwardness between Julian and Isabella slowly softened, replaced by a hesitant familiarity. The scent of Isabella's favorite jasmine perfume, once a painful reminder of his betrayal, now brought a quiet comfort. He found himself lingering in her office, ostensibly for work, but really to simply watch her. The way her brow furrowed in concentration, the sharp grace of her movements, the quiet strength in her eyes, it all captivated him. One evening, after a particularly grueling board meeting, they found themselves alone in the penthouse, Leo already asleep. The city lights glittered below, a dazzling backdrop to their hushed conversation. The air crackled with unspoken emotions. "The champagne," Isabella said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the city's hum, "was surprisingly good." It was a reference to the gala, a subtle acknowledgement of the progress they'd made. Julian nodded, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "It was. Much like this." He gestured vaguely around the room, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips. "Unexpectedly good." Isabella looked at him, her eyes searching his. The years of hurt and resentment hadn't entirely vanished, but a new understanding had taken root. "I never thought," she began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I never thought I'd see this day." "Neither did I," Julian admitted, his voice low. "I deserved." He trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of his remorse. The silence that followed wasn't strained, but contemplative. It was the silence of shared history, of unspoken apologies, of a future tentatively being built on the ruins of the past. The soft glow of the city lights illuminated their faces, highlighting the lines etched by time and hardship, but also the burgeoning hope in their eyes. A single tear traced a path down Isabella's cheek. A tear not of sorrow, but of relief, of release. Julian reached out, his touch hesitant, yet gentle, wiping away the tear. His thumb brushed against her skin, a silent gesture of forgiveness, of a love rediscovered amidst the ashes of their broken past. In that moment, amidst the glittering city lights, the foundation of a new beginning was laid, a testament to the enduring power of love, second chances, and the unwavering strength of the human spirit. The future remained unwritten, yet filled with a newfound hope. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Leo, nestled between them, stirred, his small hand clutching Julian's. The quiet intimacy of the scene was a stark contrast to the tempestuous journey that had brought them here. Isabella awoke first, her gaze lingering on Julian's sleeping face. A faint smile played on her lips, a smile born not of naive optimism, but of hard-won peace. She carefully extricated herself from the tangle of limbs, the soft cotton of the sheets whispering against her skin. The scent of freshly brewed coffee, a ritual she'd established long ago, filled the air, a comforting anchor in their newfound calm. As she poured 2 mugs, the gentle clinking of ceramic against ceramic echoed in the quiet apartment, a small symphony of domesticity. Julian stirred, his eyes fluttering open to find Isabella watching him. "Morning," he murmured, his voice husky with sleep. His hand reached out, instinctively seeking hers. She met his gaze, her own eyes softening. There was still a tremor of uncertainty, a ghost of their fractured past lingering between them, but it was now overshadowed by a tentative warmth. "Morning," she replied, her voice gentle. She handed him a mug, the warmth radiating through the ceramic. "Leo's going to be late for his painting class." He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "My fault. He's got his father's knack for lingering in bed." The admission, laced with self-deprecating humor, was a significant step. The guilt, once a suffocating weight, seemed to have eased, replaced by a growing sense of responsibility. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, punctuated only by the soft clinking of spoons and the occasional murmured word to Leo. The unspoken understanding between them was profound, a silent testament to the arduous journey they'd undertaken. The sun climbed higher, painting the city in vibrant hues. As they prepared Leo for his class, a sense of normalcy settled over them, a fragile, yet beautiful normalcy born from the ashes of their shattered past. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time in years, it felt filled with a promise they could both embrace. Weeks turned into months. The opulent boardroom, once a battlefield, now echoed with the collaborative hum of a revitalized company. Julian, no longer the detached observer, actively participated, his sharp business acumen complementing Isabella's visionary leadership. The scent of old leather and polished mahogany, once suffocating, now held a familiar comfort. One evening, after a particularly successful product launch, they stood on the penthouse balcony, the city lights twinkling like scattered diamonds. A cool breeze ruffled Isabella's hair. "It's different," Julian said, his voice barely a whisper above the city's murmur. He watched Leo chase fireflies on the meticulously manicured lawn below. Isabella smiled, a slow, thoughtful curve of her lips. "Different how?" "Better," he corrected, meeting her gaze. "I